I used to think loneliness only belonged to people who were truly alone. I learned the hard way that you can share a bed, a house, a last name, and still feel invisible. My marriage didn't break in one loud moment. It thinned slowly, like air leaking out of something you don't check until it's already flat. My husband wasn't cruel. That would have been easier. He was simply absent in the quiet ways that are hardest to accuse. Conversations ended before they began. Touch felt scheduled. I stopped expecting to be asked how my day actually felt. Asterisk, that was the state I was in when he entered my life more closely than before. He wasn't a stranger pulled from nowhere. He had always been around, part of our shared circle, familiar enough to feel safe and distant enough to feel neutral. I never noticed him in a way that mattered, not until the nights grew longer and my words stayed trapped inside my chest. He listened. That sounds small, but when you haven't been heard in a long time, it feels dangerous. Asterisk at first, it was nothing. Just conversations that didn't rush to end. He asked questions and waited for the answers. When I spoke, I didn't feel like I was interrupting something more important. I told myself this was normal, that people are allowed to talk, that loneliness doesn't make you guilty by itself. Still, something inside me stayed alert, like it knew I was standing too close to a line I didn't want to see. Asterisk, I noticed the change in myself before anything else. I cared how I looked when I knew he would be around. I replayed conversations in my head, wondering if I had said too much or revealed something I should have kept hidden. The worst part was how alive I felt afterward. That scared me more than the attention. Feeling awake again made me realize how long I had been numb. Asterisk, at home, nothing changed, and that was the problem. My husband moved through the same routines, unaware of the shift happening right beside him. I tried to reconnect, to pull him back into the space between us. I suggested dinners, shared plans, small gestures that used to mean something. He nodded, agreed, forgot. Each small disappointment stacked quietly on top of the last. And I stopped trying as hard because rejection, even passive rejection, leaves bruises, asterisk with him, the other man. There was no touching, no confessions, no dramatic declarations. Just a kind of attention that felt personal. Our conversations drifted from harmless topics into softer territory. We talked about regret, about choices that didn't turn out the way we imagined, about how people can do everything right and still feel wrong. When our eyes met, neither of us looked away too quickly, and that pause said more than words ever could. Asterisk, I knew I should pull back. I told myself that being understood doesn't mean being entitled to more. I reminded myself of vows, of promises made during a time when I still believed love stayed the same if you worked hard enough. But emotional hunger doesn't respond to logic. It responds to warmth, to recognition, to the feeling that someone sees you as more than a role you performed. Asterisk one evening, our conversation stretched longer than it should have. The room felt smaller, quieter, like the world had stepped back to watch. There was no move toward me, no hand reaching out, but the closeness was undeniable. In that moment, I felt the weight of what could happen settle in my chest. I could still walk away clean. I could choose distance. I could pretend this was nothing more than a harmless connection. Asterisk, instead, I stayed. Not physically closer, but emotionally present in a way that crossed into dangerous territory. I shared a truth I had never spoken aloud, not even to myself. I admitted how lonely I felt inside my own marriage. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was careful, respectful, heavy with understanding. He didn't take advantage of it. He didn't rush to fill it. That restraint made it harder, not easier. Asterisk, when I went home that night, the guilt arrived before I even closed the door. Nothing had happened, yet everything had changed. I lay beside my husband, staring at the ceiling, realizing that the first real betrayal wasn't physical at all. It was the moment I allowed myself to want something I knew I shouldn't, and deep down, I understood that once desire is acknowledged, it doesn't simply disappear. It waits. I told myself after that night that awareness was enough, that recognizing the danger meant I could control it. For a few days, I kept my distance. I answered messages later than usual, shortened conversations, reminded myself that restraint was still a choice. On the surface, I behaved the way I was supposed to. Inside, the silence felt louder than before. Denial didn't erase the connection. It sharpened it. Asterisk, I tried again with my husband, not out of passion, but responsibility. I asked him to sit with me, to talk, to notice me. He listened the way people do when they think listening is the same as understanding. His answers were practical, quick, empty of curiosity. He assured me everything was fine because nothing was visibly broken. I realized then that my unhappiness had become invisible to him, and that invisibility hurt more than anger ever could. Asterisk, the more I felt dismissed at home, the more carefully I guarded myself around the other man. He seemed to notice the shift immediately. Instead of pushing, he slowed down. That should have helped. It didn't. His restraint felt like respect, and respect has a way of disarming defenses. When he finally spoke about what had been hanging between us, he didn't dress it up as romance or destiny. He simply said he felt the same pull and didn't know what to do with it. Asterisk, there was no pressure in his words, no demand for an answer. That made the choice mine alone, and I hated that. I wanted circumstances to force me one way or the other so I wouldn't have to carry the responsibility. But life rarely offers that kind of escape. He told me he would step back if I asked. I knew that if I said the word, he would disappear from that space in my life completely. I didn't say it. Instead, I said things that circled the truth without naming it. I talked about confusion, about feeling lost, about not recognizing myself anymore. He listened the same way he always did, with patience that made me feel seen. Somewhere between those words and the silence that followed them, I felt the line shift under my feet. It wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, internal, and irreversible. Asterisk, when it happened, there was no sudden rush or reckless abandon. It was careful, almost hesitant, like both of us understood the weight of what we were choosing. Nothing explicit needs to be said to explain it. The betrayal lived in the intention, in the consent to step into a space that belonged to someone else. I remember thinking that this was supposed to feel wrong immediately, that guilt should drown out everything else. Instead, I felt relief. That realization scared me more than the act itself. Relief meant I had been starving emotionally for longer than I wanted to admit. Relief meant I had crossed the line, not because I was weak, but because something in me had been empty for too long. That didn't excuse what I had done. It only explained why I didn't stop. Asterisk afterward, the world didn't collapse. That was another shock. My life continued to look the same from the outside. No alarm sounded. No truth exposed itself dramatically. I went home, spoke in normal tones, moved through routines as if nothing had shifted. But inside me, everything felt altered, like I was living slightly out of alignment with my own reflection. Asterisk, the guilt arrived later in fragments. It showed up in moments that had nothing to do with him. When my husband laughed at something small, when he reached for me absent-mindedly, when he trusted me without hesitation. Each of those moments pressed against my chest like a quiet accusation. I had wanted to feel alive, not cool. I had wanted connection, not deception. Asterisk, the other man didn't celebrate what had happened. There was no illusion that this was a victory. If anything, he seemed heavier afterward, more cautious. That should have reassured me, but it didn't erase the fact that we had crossed a boundary together. The mutual understanding between us was now layered with something darker, something that couldn't be undone by pretending it never happened. Asterisk, I began to realize that infidelity isn't a single act you commit and move past. It's a choice that keeps echoing, forcing new decisions every day. Do you continue? Do you confess? Do you retreat into silence and hope time dulls the edges? Each option carried its own damage, and I hadn't yet found the courage to face any of them fully. Asterisk. What I knew for certain was this: I could no longer pretend I was innocent. Whatever came next, I would have to carry the truth of what I had chosen, even if no one else ever knew. The days after that moment felt heavier than I expected. It wasn't the secrecy itself that weighed on me, it was the constant awareness that I had changed something in myself that couldn't be reversed. Each smile I offered my husband, each casual conversation carried a hidden tension, a reminder that I was living a life that no longer fully belonged to me. I began noticing the smallest things, like the way he laughed without looking at me or how he touched me absent-mindedly, and every gesture seemed to underline the distance I had created. Asterisk guilt isn't loud. It doesn't storm in with a single declaration. It arrives in quiet, creeping ways. I felt it when I caught myself comparing the way he made me feel to the emptiness I had grown used to. I felt it when I replayed conversations in my head, analyzing each word I had spoken to the other man, wondering if it had revealed too much, hinted too clearly at my emotional betrayal. Even in moments of silence, my mind refused rest. The weight of knowing I had been unfaithful emotionally and implied physically pressed into my chest constantly. Asterisk, the other man sensed the shift too. He pulled back, not because he wanted to punish me or to erase what happened, but because he understood the burden I was carrying. Distance became a tool of protection, and every message we exchanged became more careful, more deliberate. The brief warmth we had shared now existed as a reminder rather than a comfort, a reflection of the emotional line we had crossed. It was almost worse than if there had been confrontation, because unresolved tension has a way of lodging itself into your consciousness and refusing to leave. Asterisk at home. My husband started noticing changes he couldn't name. He asked questions I couldn't answer honestly, and each evasive reply felt like another fracture in the walls I was trying to maintain. I realized that concealment isn't a shield. It's a slow leak that erodes trust even without exposure. I tried to reconnect, to anchor myself back in the marriage I had once valued. I suggested plans, small gestures, moments meant to restore closeness. But the space inside me had already shifted. My engagement with life at home was colored by guilt, making my words sound distant even when I meant them to be sincere. Asterisk sleep became a battleground for my thoughts. I replayed conversations, imagined outcomes, and considered the consequences of every possible choice. There were times when I wanted to confess immediately, to unburden myself, but fear anchored me. Fear of losing what remained, fear of judgment, fear of realizing that confession could not undo the damage that had already been done. The silence I maintained wasn't peace, it was a tense, delicate suspension, a holding pattern that made every day feel fragile. Asterisk, I started noticing patterns in myself I hadn't seen before. I questioned my own morality, my capacity for loyalty, and my ability to trust my own impulses. The act of betrayal had exposed vulnerabilities I didn't know I had, and I couldn't return to my former sense of self. Emotional infidelity is not a momentary lapse. It is a mirror that forces you to confront parts of yourself you may have ignored. I saw a version of me that was capable of desire beyond reason, and that version would not easily be silenced. Asterisk. There were moments when my husband's presence reminded me sharply of what I had risked. Seeing him relaxed, trusting, unguarded, felt almost unbearable. It wasn't hatred or resentment. It was the stark contrast between the life I was living in secrecy and the life I had promised to protect. Every interaction, no matter how ordinary, now carried a dual meaning: surface normalcy masking internal conflict. I understood with a clarity I hadn't anticipated that my actions had consequences that stretched far beyond my immediate awareness. Asterisk. The other man's retreat offered both relief and new tension. Without the immediate warmth we had shared, I was left alone with the echoes of what had happened and the knowledge that my choices were mine alone to manage. He didn't disappear entirely, but every interaction was measured, deliberate, careful. That distance forced me to face the reality of my decisions without distraction or comfort. The tension became unbearable at times, pressing me to decide whether I would continue hiding, confess, or attempt some other way to reconcile what I had done with who I wanted to be. Asterisk. It became painfully clear that infidelity is never contained. It doesn't end with a single act or vanish once secrecy is maintained. Every thought, every glance, every choice is now layered with the memory of what crossed the line. I realized that living with guilt is not simply a consequence, it is a constant companion, shaping perception, dictating behavior, and altering the way every relationship functions. I could not pretend ignorance. I could not undo what had been done. And yet, I was still responsible for the life I continued to lead, for the relationships I had not yet broken, and for the truth I had not yet spoken. The truth was inevitable. I could feel it pressing against the edges of my carefully maintained facade, waiting for the moment I could no longer avoid it. Living with the weight of what I had done had changed me in ways I couldn't ignore. It wasn't just guilt. It was awareness. Every choice I made now carried the imprint of my actions, and I realized that postponing honesty would only amplify the damage. The silence I had depended on could no longer protect me, and I understood that finally facing the consequences was the only way forward. Asterisk. I decided to speak first, to unburden myself before suspicion forced the revelation. The words came slowly, each one measured, carrying the weight of acknowledgement. I admitted the emotional betrayal, hinted at the momentary closeness that had occurred, and confessed my own failings without embellishment. There was no excuse, no attempt to soften the truth with justification. I simply stated what had happened and accepted that the repercussions would unfold naturally. Relief came instantly, followed by a raw, anxious anticipation of how it would be received. Asterisk. My husband listened. The silence that followed was tense, heavy, but not chaotic. He asked questions, not to attack, but to understand. I answered honestly, refusing to hide any detail I could articulate without causing unnecessary pain. It was agonizing, but it was also necessary. The confrontation forced me to see the full extent of the impact of my actions, not just on myself, but on the life I had shared with him. I realized that reconciliation would not be immediate, and perhaps it might never fully occur. But honesty had opened the only door available to a semblance of clarity. Asterisk. The other man was no longer a presence in my daily life, and I recognized that his distance was part of the resolution. We had both crossed a line we couldn't uncross, and the restraint he exercised afterward became a quiet testament to the consequences of desire unchecked by circumstance. His absence forced me to face my own feelings without distraction or justification. I had to reckon with the truth that the connection had been fleeting but meaningful, and that meaning carried responsibility rather than reward. Asterisk. I began the slow process of rebuilding boundaries. Every interaction with my husband, every choice to engage honestly required vigilance. I learned that trust is not something that can be reclaimed instantly. It must be rebuilt brick by brick, moment by moment, through consistency and transparency. My awareness of how fragile relationships can be transformed my approach to communication, empathy, and accountability. I realized that love is not sustained by habit alone. It requires active effort, acknowledgement of mistakes, and willingness to change. Asterisk. Guilt remained, but it evolved into something more constructive. It became a guide, a reminder of where I had failed and what needed attention. I recognized patterns in myself that previously went unexamined, the ways I sought attention, the ways I avoided confrontation, the ways I allowed distance to grow in my marriage. This introspection was painful but essential. It clarified my priorities, reshaped my values, and instilled a newfound commitment to act with integrity, even when it felt uncomfortable or inconvenient. Asterisk, the emotional landscape of my life shifted fundamentally. I no longer lived in the naive assumption that desire alone could define my choices or that secrecy could shield me from consequence. I understood with uncomfortable clarity that every action carries weight, and that avoiding truth only postpones reckoning. Acceptance became my tool, acceptance of what happened, of what could not be undone, and of the responsibility I bore to live differently moving forward. Asterisk by the end. The story of my infidelity was no longer a secret burden, but a chapter of awareness. It reshaped my interactions, deepened my understanding of myself, and refined my approach to relationships. The consequences were lasting, and the trust I once took for granted required patience and honesty to rebuild. I learned that facing truth, no matter how uncomfortable, is the only path to authenticity, growth, and the possibility of meaningful connection beyond the shadows of past mistakes. Asterisk, I understood finally that the past cannot be erased, and mistakes are permanent markers in life's journey. Yet, the way forward exists in responsibility, accountability, and conscious effort. Living with awareness rather than denial became the measure of my character, and in that commitment, I discovered a form of peace not through forgetting, excusing, or avoiding, but through fully embracing the consequences and choosing to live with integrity despite them.